In 1518, in the narrow cobblestone streets of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped out of her house and began to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. There was only a silent, frantic, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to possess her limbs. She didn't stop for an hour. She didn't stop for a day. By the end of the week, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, 400 people were caught in a macabre, involuntary marathon that would become one of history's most terrifying and inexplicable medical mysteries. This wasn't a party, it was a death sentence. Imagine the sheer physical agony. We've all felt that burn in our calves after a long walk or a workout, but these people were pushing past the point of muscle failure, past the point of dehydration, until their feet were bloodied pulp against the stones. They were screaming for help while their bodies refused to stop moving. To the onlookers, it looked like a demonic possession. To modern scientists, it's a puzzle that still doesn't quite fit together. Why did the authorities at the time decide the best cure for a dancing plague was more dancing? They actually built a stage and hired musicians, believing that if the afflicted just danced it out, the fever would break. Instead, it acted like gasoline on a fire. Now, you're probably thinking, this has to be an exaggeration. But the city records, physician notes, and local chronicles of the time are disturbingly consistent. People were dropping dead from heart attacks and strokes mid-stride. Was it ergot poisoning? A fungus on rye bread that acts like a primitive version of LSD? Or was it the ultimate mass psychogenic illness, triggered by the extreme famine and disease ravaging the region, causing a collective brain snap? The dancing plague of 1518 remains the ultimate WTF moment in human history, a chilling reminder of how little we actually understand about the connection between the human mind and the body it inhabits. Even today, the question lingers. If the right psychological pressure is applied, could it happen again? To understand why hundreds of people danced themselves to death in the summer of 1518, we must first understand Strasbourg itself, not as a postcard city of canals and cathedrals, but as a pressure cooker of misery. Strasbourg in the early 16th century sat at the crossroads of Europe, both geographically and culturally. It was a free imperial city within the Holy Roman Empire, wealthy on paper, but brutally unequal in practice. Merchants, guild leaders, and clergy lived comfortably behind stone walls, while the majority of the population existed one failed harvest away from starvation. And by 1518, failure had arrived. The years leading up to the outbreak were marked by climate instability, part of what historians now call the Little Ice Age. Winters were longer, summers were unpredictable, crops rotted in the fields or failed to grow at all. Grain prices soared beyond what the poor could afford. Malnutrition weakened immune systems. Disease spread rapidly. Smallpox, syphilis, leprosy, plague. Death was not an abstract fear, it was a daily neighbor. Add to this a deeply religious worldview in which illness was punishment, suffering was spiritual, and invisible forces shaped human fate. People believed saints could curse bodies, demons could hijack limbs, God could withdraw his protection without warning. This is the world Frau Trophäa stepped into when she walked outside and began to dance. It's hard to wrap your head around, right? A city literally dancing itself to the grave. If you're sitting there wondering how history can be this much weirder than a horror movie, you're exactly where I was when I first found this story. Before we reveal the terrifying final records of what happened to the survivors and the modern-day glitch that proves this could happen again, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We track down the most bizarre, unexplained corners of history every week, and you don't want to be the one missing out when the next mystery drops. Done? Good. Because we need to talk about the red shoes. On a July morning in 1518, Frau Trophäa, likely a working-class woman, possibly already malnourished, left her home and began moving her body in the street. Not gracefully, not joyfully. Witnesses described her movements as erratic, convulsive, desperate. There was no music, no celebration, no audience at first. She danced because she could not stop. Hours passed. Her feet swelled, her muscles locked and released in violent spasms. Neighbors begged her to rest. Some tried to restrain her. She tore free and kept moving. By nightfall, she collapsed from exhaustion, only to rise again hours later and continue. This detail matters. She slept, then resumed. This rules out performance, fraud, or deliberate behavior. Whatever was happening was not voluntary. Within days, others joined her. Men, women, children. They did not dance with her. They danced like her. By the end of the first week, 34 people were dancing. By the end of the month, over 400. The outbreak followed no known disease pattern. It was not spread through touch, water, or air. Entire families remained unaffected while neighbors collapsed in the streets. Yet once it started, it accelerated. Chroniclers recorded people dancing until their ribs cracked from exhaustion. Some screamed prayers while spinning uncontrollably. Others wept as their legs continued moving beneath them. The most horrifying detail is this: they begged for help. This was not hysteria in the modern, dismissive sense. These people knew something was terribly wrong. Deaths followed: heart attacks, strokes, sheer physical collapse. Bodies were carried away while others continued dancing beside them. The City Council of Strasbourg faced a nightmare scenario. They consulted physicians, the best medical minds of the era, and the doctors reached a conclusion that sounds insane to us now, but made sense then. The dancing was caused by overheated blood. Their solution? Let them dance it out. A stage was erected in the city square. Musicians were hired. Professional dancers were brought in to guide the afflicted. This decision transformed a tragedy into a catastrophe. Music amplified the outbreak. The rhythm acted like fuel, drawing more bodies into motion. Observers began swaying. Some joined involuntarily. Within days, the death toll spiked. Only then did authorities reverse course, banning music, dismantling the stage, and transporting dancers to the shrine of Saint Vitus, a figure long associated with involuntary movement disorders. In medieval Europe, Saint Vitus was believed to curse sinners with uncontrollable dancing. The condition was even known as Saint Vitus's dance. Victims were taken to his shrine, fitted with red shoes marked with holy symbols, and subjected to prayers, fasting, and exorcism rituals. Strangely, after weeks, the outbreak faded. Not suddenly, gradually, as if the collective nervous system of the city finally exhaled. Modern scientists have proposed ergotism as a possible explanation. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye, the staple grain of the poor. It produces alkaloids chemically similar to LSD. Symptoms include hallucinations, convulsions, muscle spasms, psychosis. Sounds convincing until it doesn't. Ergot causes painful vasoconstriction, often leading to gangrene. Victims usually become immobile, not hyperactive. And ergot outbreaks don't stop because music stops. Something else was at work. The most accepted modern explanation is mass psychogenic illness, a phenomenon where extreme psychological stress manifests physically across groups. But this isn't people pretending. Brain scans of modern cases show real neurological disruption. In 1518, Strasbourg had chronic famine, religious terror, constant disease, social repression, no concept of mental health. The human nervous system can only endure so much. The dancing may have been a collective neurological collapse, the body screaming when the mind could no longer speak. The dancing plague unsettles modern medicine because it exposes a truth we still don't like to admit. The boundary between mind and body is thinner than we want to believe. Under the right conditions, stress, fear, belief, and social reinforcement, the body can revolt against conscious control. And it raises a chilling question. If it happened once, could it happen again? By the time the authorities realized they had made a catastrophic mistake, Strasbourg no longer felt like a city governed by people. It felt like a body having a seizure. The sound of feet striking stone echoed day and night, an uneven thunder that refused to fade. The dancers were no longer clustered in one place. They spilled into alleys, doorways, church steps. Some moved in tight, frantic circles. Others staggered forward as if pulled by something only they could see. Faces twisted in terror, mouths open in prayers that went unanswered, eyes unfocused, as though the mind had stepped aside and left the body behind. What haunted witnesses most was not the movement, but the awareness. These people were conscious. They recognized friends. They cried when they saw their children watching. They screamed when their legs buckled and then rose again, obeying commands that did not come from thought or will. Several accounts describe dancers trying to smash their own feet against walls in an attempt to injure themselves badly enough to be forced into stillness. It didn't work. Pain did nothing. Exhaustion did nothing. The rhythm continued, as if some internal metronome had been wound too tight to stop. Inside the human body, muscle fibers were tearing themselves apart. Without rest, the chemical balance of the bloodstream collapsed. Potassium levels spiked. Heat built faster than it could dissipate. The heart, forced to maintain a tempo it was never designed for, began to misfire. A healthy adult might withstand this for hours. A malnourished laborer, already weakened by famine, had days at most, and many did not even have that. People began to die in public, not quietly, not peacefully. They fell suddenly, limbs locking mid-motion, faces frozen in expressions of shock. Some collapsed forward, skulls cracking on stone. Others simply stopped, hearts giving out as if someone had cut a wire. The bodies were dragged away, sometimes before the final twitch faded, because leaving them where they fell seemed to encourage others. Death itself had become contagious. And still the physicians clung to their explanation. Overheated blood, excess motion burning off excess heat, a fever of movement that required more movement. From their perspective, stopping the dancers would trap the illness inside them, causing something worse. They had no concept of neurological overload, no language for trauma, no model for psychological contagion. What they had instead was doctrine, and doctrine is difficult to kill. Music was meant to impose order, drums for pacing, pipes for harmony, professional dancers to demonstrate control. But the human nervous system does not respond to order under extreme stress. It responds to permission. Rhythm does not calm panic. It gives panic a shape. Once the musicians began playing, the movements sharpened, the chaos synchronized. Feet struck stone in rough unison. Bodies swayed together. What had been scattered suffering began to resemble ritual. Observers felt it too. Chroniclers describe onlookers feeling a strange pressure in their legs, an urge to move, a buzzing under the skin. Some left quickly, terrified. Others stayed too long and never left at all. The boundary between spectator and participant dissolved. This was no longer illness observed from a distance. It was immersion. Eventually, even the city council could not ignore the mounting corpses. Fear began to shift direction. If this was overheated blood, why were the strongest dying first? If movement was the cure, why did the dancers grow worse? The explanation began to rot under the weight of its consequences. Religion rushed in to fill the vacuum. In a society where God explained everything that science could not, the failure of medicine was interpreted as proof that the problem was never physical to begin with. This was not blood. This was punishment. Strasbourg had offended something older and more powerful than human knowledge. The dancing was not a symptom, it was a sentence. Saint Vitus emerged from centuries of superstition like a shadow stepping into firelight. His name had long been associated with uncontrollable motion, with jerks and spasms and convulsions. To anger him was to lose command of your limbs. To appease him was the only hope of regaining control. The solution shifted overnight. Music was silenced. Stages were torn down. What had been encouraged was suddenly forbidden. The dancers were gathered, those who could still stand, and transported out of the city, away from crowds, away from witnesses, away from reinforcement. They were taken to shrines where movement was not celebrated but feared, where stillness was sacred, where the story finally changed. Something remarkable happened then, not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dancing weakened. The spasms shortened. The intervals between movements grew longer. Some collapsed and did not rise again, but this time they stayed still because they could, not because they had died. To a modern observer, this looks like the nervous system finally escaping a feedback loop. Remove the stimulus, remove the audience, remove the belief that dancing is inevitable, and the body begins to recover. But to the people of 1518, the interpretation was simpler and far more satisfying. The saint had been appeased. The curse was lifting. When the last dancer stopped, Strasbourg did not celebrate. It exhaled. The streets returned to silence, but the silence felt fragile, as if sound itself might provoke the city back into motion. The event was recorded carefully, almost obsessively, by clerks and physicians and priests, not because they understood it, but because they were afraid of forgetting it. And then the most unsettling realization set in. This had happened before. Long before Strasbourg, entire communities along the Rhine and the Meuse had experienced similar outbreaks. Groups of people dancing uncontrollably, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks. Processions forming spontaneously. Deaths occurring without violence or disease. The pattern repeated across centuries, always during times of extreme stress. Famine, plague, religious upheaval, social collapse. This was not an isolated madness. It was a human response. Modern neuroscience struggles with this because it forces an uncomfortable truth into the open. The brain is not a fortress of rational control. It is an organ shaped by survival. Under overwhelming stress, it prioritizes release over logic. If emotion cannot be spoken, it is discharged. If fear cannot be processed, it is expressed. And if the only culturally acceptable language of suffering is movement, then the body moves until it breaks. We see fragments of this today. Not dancing plagues, but fainting epidemics. Paralysis without injury. Tremors without disease. Symptoms that spread socially, not biologically. They are dismissed, minimized, renamed, but they are not gone. The mechanism still exists. The wiring is the same. The dancing plague of 1518 terrifies historians not because it was bizarre, but because it was plausible. It required no exotic toxin, no supernatural force, no lost technology. It required pressure, belief, reinforcement, and a population with nowhere else to put its pain. That is the part no one likes to linger on, because if the right conditions align, prolonged stress, collective fear, social permission, the question is no longer whether something like this could happen again. The question is what form it would take, and whether we would recognize it while it was happening or only after the bodies stopped moving. If this story unsettled you, good. It was meant to, because history doesn't just live in books, it lives in us. If you want more hidden chapters like this, more moments where reality slips and the human mind shows its cracks, subscribe. Like the video so it reaches the people who need to see it, and comment below. Do you think this could happen again? Or are we already living through our own version of it? The danger in stories like this is thinking they belong to the past. It's comforting to imagine that the people of 1518 were uniquely fragile, uniquely ignorant, uniquely susceptible. That they danced because they didn't know better, because they lacked science, because they believed in curses and saints and invisible hands pulling at their limbs. But that belief is a shield, and it's a thin one. Strip away the cobblestones, strip away the shrines, strip away St. Vitus and the humors and the overheated blood. What remains is a nervous system under siege. The human brain did not evolve for constant stress. It evolved for bursts of danger followed by relief. Run from the predator, hide from the storm, survive, then recover. Strasbourg never recovered. The famine dragged on, disease never left. Fear became background noise. And when stress becomes permanent, the brain looks for any exit it can find. Sometimes that exit is panic. Sometimes it's collapse. Sometimes it's movement. Modern medicine calls it mass psychogenic illness, but the name does not make it safer. It only makes it sound controlled. In reality, it is the same phenomenon wearing a lab coat. Entire schools have erupted in fainting spells with no toxin found. Factories have shut down after workers developed identical tremors, blindness, or paralysis with no physical cause. Communities have reported waves of symptoms that spread faster than any virus, jumping from body to body through expectation alone. No pathogen, no poison, no single origin point, just pressure finding a way out. What makes the dancing plague uniquely terrifying is that it didn't look like illness. It looked like action, like participation, like something people were choosing even as they begged to stop. That illusion of choice is the most dangerous part. It allows observers to blame the victims. It allows authorities to misread the threat. And it allows the system creating the pressure to continue untouched. Strasbourg didn't fix famine. It didn't end disease. It didn't reduce fear. It simply waited for the bodies to fail. When the last dancer stopped, nothing had been solved. The conditions that caused the outbreak remained. They always do. History doesn't repeat itself because people forget. It repeats because the underlying machinery stays the same. Today, the music is different. The stages are digital. The crowds are global. Stress no longer comes from failed harvests alone, but from constant exposure, constant comparison, constant uncertainty. The body still absorbs it. The nervous system still keeps score, and when it can't process anymore, it will find expression. Maybe not dancing, maybe silence, maybe rage, maybe collapse, maybe something we don't yet have a name for. That is why the dancing plague of 1518 refuses to stay buried. It's not a curiosity, it's a warning. A reminder that the line between order and chaos does not run through governments or technologies or centuries. It runs through the human body itself. And when enough bodies are pushed past their limit at the same time, history doesn't need a reason to break. If this story gave you chills, imagine how many more are waiting to be uncovered. Hit subscribe to explore the darkest, most mysterious corners of history. Like the video to keep these hidden stories alive, and drop a comment. Do you think something like the dancing plague could happen again in our modern world? Don't just watch history, witness it.